All right, welcome back, everyone, in our hall one. I hope you had a refreshing little break. Yeah, some coffee, maybe a snack, maybe two snacks, in my case. We're welcoming to our stage Kalle, who is the CTO of Managed Services, making sure that FECO delivers the best possible offering for their service customers. And in this talk, we'll tell you all about real-life experiences of upkeep, maintenance, support, and service for GitHub Enterprise servers, because that's what they have a lot of experience with doing. So here to tell the tale, please give it up for Kalle.
Hello, most of you I have forced here to listen to my talk. Almost everybody in the first 3 rows, so welcome. So my topic is failing is learning. So my Slack nickname and IRC nickname is actually Failattu, which is kind of a play on words, which means I fail. I'm a successful failure of 30 years, and today I'm going to talk about 10 of those years. So I'm CTO of the Managed Services. I own a sailing boat. I lived in Germany for a moment, and then I moved back to Finland and joined FECode and founded a product there, which is service, which is hard to explain, but yeah, I do things. And I've been doing DevOps for all the time I know. So today we're talking about GitHub Enterprise Server. How many of you know that GitHub Enterprise comes as a self-installable deployable server version? So a lot of 3 people. That's fantastic. So they made it for GDPR, latency, and authentication, and the paranoid customers, according to GitHub. We found one customer 10 years ago who told us we need it for latency. They wanted to get rid of HashVN. We'll get there in a bit later. But basically, everything is about latency for them. And GitHub.com is still too slow, according to them. We'll get there also. So you can customize, you can do things. It's fantastic. Everything is amazing, but we'll get there. This is a quote I use in almost all of my talks. Most of the developers that we know, they don't want to do anything about DevOps, infrastructure, any of the stuff we're talking about, any of the stuff we guys love here. If you're working with developers, they just want to deploy the application and see how the customer reacts. It was a great quote from DigitalOcean. That's what we try to do. We try to take all of the complication from the customer and solve it so that they can focus on delivering value. What does that mean? This is your average banking software development pipeline. How you do delivery and what happens, and every single red box is a manual step which you try to automate, and you fight and you fight and you do. This is where you create the value. That's all the value that gets shown to a customer. So all of this comes down to this, and that's where we create the value. Everything else is just controls, management, so on. So why are we doing all of that steps, and how do what's going on? Like, how did we get here? Well, that's not today's talk, but our aim is that the developer can do this, and everything else, at least infrastructure-wise, works on today's talk. This is the kind of challenges that create everything that I'm working on today. I would like to point out the legacy architectures. That's amazing. We'll get to GitHub's architecture. It's amazing. Abused infrastructure is another great thing. We will get to GitHub Actions and about that. And complicated networking, amazing. Like enterprise networking, my favorite topic of the world. We'll get to that also. GitHub Enterprise Server, when you go to the install server page, it tells you, here's an application image. Just deploy it and everything works. It's black box. Don't ask questions. Like, just deploy it and put these variables in the HTTPS URL that you have. And no, don't touch anything in the box. Don't go to the box. Don't go to the box. It works. You don't need the documentation on the commands that happen inside the machine. You don't go. Like, you have to open a GitHub support ticket to do things. Like, if it goes down, open a GitHub support ticket. we'll get back to you. We're in the managed services, so I have a uptime requirement, SLA, reaction times, response times, and I promise customers that it works. So what we've been doing, reverse engineering all of it. Like, we know what's going on there. We know, after Microsoft came, the MySQL is bit by bit being converted to a Microsoft SQL server. Amazing. That means you're running not only MySQL, but also MS SQL in the same box. You have an Elasticsearch there. You have a Redis there. You have a bunch of Ruby code. So much Ruby code. It's amazing. And every single command is there, ready. You just need to know what's happening. And every time something breaks, it's Nomad nowadays. They installed Nomad. If something breaks, the first thing to do is reboot Nomad. Usually everything gets working after that. I don't know why, but that's what happens. We have a documentation for that also nowadays. So deploying it is easy. Like, you just deploy the AMI. No worries. Well, yeah. As said, that's what we've been doing. Fantastic. For example, the management portal for the admin, which is in another port, can break. And that portal manages everything. So if you want to do certain things, you would have to reboot the GitHub. But we'll get to the rebooting of GitHub. And that means you can't, for example, update the license for a customer. Because updating a license takes time, might be a critical thing. They are full and they don't have more users. And GitHub, by the way, stops working if you go over the license in the server. So what we did is we found the command line commands, used them, and it doesn't work. Actually, it works, but you have to also know that after running that command, which installs the license, you have to also tell it, hey, reload all the configurations, which is not downtime. It happens in the background, but you have to know that. There's no documentation, by the way, for this, because everything is in the UI, in the GitHub documentation. Fantastic, but there is a command for it, and you can do it. And then you can reboot it when you actually have time and scheduled downtime. As said, customer of ours, a game company, was working in SVN. They had a bunch of SVN repos, like, let's say 600 gigabytes of data. And this is when we came in and we were like, yeah, let's go to Git. Like, all of that data to Git. Without Git LFS. That was 10 years ago. Git LFS was not a thing yet. Like, it exists, but nobody believed in it. So we have repositories that are over 10 gigabytes in size. Which means if we send GitHub the support package for that repository, the support answers to me, it's too big. Remove the binaries. And I'm, okay, but like, I have an actual problem. Not today's talk, but like, then we figured it out by sending another repository that was similarly broken, which was smaller. Because it was just an archiving and optimizing thing. There is a tool called SVN Bridge, which allowed us to connect SVN to GitHub and synchronize SVN commits to GitHub and GitHub commits to SVN. It's called SVN Bridge. It was a temporary measurement, which we deployed for a moment. It's been now 10 years, soon 11. It's still running. None of the SVN users have moved away. We're trying. Every year we send an email, end of life SVN. Every year I agree with the customer, we're going to kill the SVN now. And every year the developers come back and inform, we're going to be late on the game deployment. And then the business informs us, no, they are not going to be late. Like, that's not possible. So SVN Bridge still works there. The only problem is that we deployed it so that we wrote one line of documentation. What do you do if it breaks? Kill -9 SVN Bridge. Okay, yeah, great. Would be fantastic if we had actually documented what we did and why that works, but it works, and it works. Just don't touch it. I just added last year a new repository there because they added more SVN repositories. Like, we're just trying to kill it for 10 years, like, So having SVN running or GitHubs, we have 20 of these or something like that nowadays. And GitHub server, when you boot it up, it doesn't boot immediately because it has all the services that we were talking about: Redis, Elasticsearch, MS SQL, MySQL, so on. Like, it has to boot all of that up. Then it needs to verify, check if there's migrations, because it checks, did you upgrade it? Because that's how you upgrade it. You boot it up. So if you have a downtime because something broke and you have to boot the whole server, it means 15-minute downtime minimum. So if customer asks me 99.9%, if I have to boot it even once, I'm done. My whole SLA is gone. That's my whole uptime SLA. So what you can build is clustering, which GitHub tells you nope, and you're like, okay, so no clustering. It's not enabled. You have to get the license enabled by telling GitHub why you need the clustering. And according to GitHub, it's flaky. So it exists. We can build it, but we haven't built good enough business case yet. But we can have an active passive clustering. Did I talk about the legacy architectures? Active passive, like, nice. At least I have a clustering. So when the region goes down, I have the other one up and running. So easy. It took us a while to understand that, hey, by the way, you need to run it on active passive clustering, because if the thing breaks, you basically have to promote the other one to master, because you are not going to recover it in reasonable time. Just get the other passive node up and figure out what's going on in the other one. And then create another, throw it to trash and deploy a new one. So when things actually break, you need active passive. Fantastic. How do we migrate? So we got through GitHub. We have GitHubs running. We've been crying, sweeping. And then I get the genius idea as a CTO that, hey, GitHub and GitLab are becoming big things. Like, we need to really get into the train properly. Jenkins is dead. Like, Bitbucket is dead. Atlassian told us data center is gone. Server is gone. Data center still exists. But basically that means GitHub and GitLab are there fighting for the Bitbucket customers heavily. So, great. Now we have more GitHub customers coming in. Microsoft purchased GitHub, which means they are GitHub is included in the enterprise agreement, which means every single Microsoft customer who is big customer can buy a GitHub enterprise server for free, basically. It costs money, but the enterprise agreement is very fantastic, which makes the question from those customers, how do we actually migrate to this tool? Like, we were told this is basically like exists for us. And then you have a bunch of tools which enable you to migrate. And I have to actually say, GitHub Wallet, nowadays I think it has a different name. I think it's GitHub CI Migrator or something like that. But that's a fantastic tool. You know, you have the Jenkins, fantastic. Well, you can run this command, or one command, and it tells you, I can migrate 80% of your jobs. This is how I do it. This is the GitHub action for it. And you're like, wait, I can get 80% of my stuff from Jenkins to GitHub in one go? Well, you're not going to do it in one go. You want to test it, but ideologically, we can actually analyze a Jenkins for once, and we don't have to go to the customer and be like, well, let's see if we can actually go from Jenkins to GitHub Actions. Like, we don't know what you've been building. Like, how much Java have you written? And the customer is like, everything is Java. Then you go there and you realize, no, nothing is Java. Everything has been done in the UI by clicking. And that's what happens. So migrations got really easy. Like, tooling has been good. Sometimes you have to write Ruby code though, but like, we can all understand Ruby code exists. Some people like it. So we've gotten through, we've deployed, we've migrated. So then we get to the fantastic time of IT. Hey, backups. Yeah, you can take a snapshot of the machine. Fantastic, great. It takes 48 hours of our IT vendor for that game company to take a snapshot. And the GitHub goes down for the whole snapshot taking. we asked them, have you actually tested that? Does this backup work? They answered to us, you haven't paid for us to test these. So after that, we started looking into how do we actually do backups, like this massive snapshot and this vendor that promises us that they are taking the snapshots. We're not going to trust any of the things that they're saying. So we got the GitHub backup client running. It's fantastic if you have free cheap disk and you can just dump it on the disk. But if you're in Azure, like we are in many things, or AWS or Google Cloud, it requires a solid disk under it. So you can't put it to S3, you can't put it to blob storage, you can't put it to GCP directly. You have to put it first to the disk and then push it there. So when you have 300, 500, 1 terabyte of Git data, like some people have, if you remember 10 gigabyte repositories, 500 gigabytes from SVN, which is not supposed to be in Git, but you know that happens. It becomes pretty expensive. So we've been looking, we might someday do a pull request to it. Haven't done it yet. Then IAM, so GitHub has fantastic support. Sorry, I actually forgot to update this slide. Scheme 2.0 is now in beta for GitHub Server. So in a few years, we can actually integrate it to Azure AD properly. But ideologically, you can integrate the authentication with GitHub, get AudUp working. That works perfectly. You don't have to touch the AudUp. Groups work, users work, so on. Users get disabled. But the SSO has this small problem. You don't get the groups. That I think we got fixed by having another script. There's another script which enables you to synchronize the groups. You don't get to disable users. You need another script to disable the users. You don't get to push the users. You need another script for that. So then we sent GitHub some feedback because we had a customer with 6,000 users, 60,000 repositories, I think, and asked them, do we need to deploy a Kubernetes cluster to run these scripts per organization? And they told us, yes, until the Scheme 2.0 comes out. We're waiting. It's now out, so we're going to move to that. Next time I'm going to keep this talk, maybe I talk about Scheme. But it's an enterprise product, like, you know, sometimes SSO is difficult. And sometimes it breaks. So this is what actually caused us to start selling GitHub Server again when the GitHub Actions arrived on the server. So if you don't know what GitHub Actions are, they are your CI pipeline in steroids on version control. So what you usually want, what we were talking, developer experience, like making developers easier, having them nicer, enjoying life. Well, most of my engineers only use version control, Slack for sending cat pictures, and some IDE, usually Vim. They are Linux nerds. That's the tools I have. Like if I try to affect anything else, like I have a Jira, I create the tickets to Jira, but they are not going to take the Jira tickets unless someone tells them in Slack, for example, that hey, there's a ticket for you. They're not going to go to Jira themselves at the beginning of the morning. They're going to start by opening the terminal, opening the IDE, and then Slack. And you have to get that working. Well, this integrates to the version control by bringing the pull request data and having the CI info there. As you could notice, I didn't say that they would go to Jenkins. They don't go to Jenkins. Like I had to integrate Jenkins so that it sends feedback to pull requests. This does it automatically. No need to do the integrations. And that led to the situation when Microsoft released Actions to github.com. Every single customer that we had, all 4 at that time, was, can you re-enable the Actions? Can we get the Actions running? Like, how are we getting the Actions running? They just came out. And I get to go to the customers and be like, it's GitHub Enterprise Server that you have. Let's check next year. So GitHub Enterprise Server releases features about a year later. Sometimes never. We'll get to code spaces and Copilot. I don't think Neater is coming for server at the moment. but that's okay. We can live without those. Then we finally got the actions, and we were like, okay, let's deploy them to everybody, and we did. And that led to the how do you actually run actions? Because like customer hadn't even considered running the actions, like they had just been asking us. They hadn't thought about it, like we actually need to tell them how to use GitHub Actions. Like, yeah. Then we got to the proxies, like I told you, enterprise networks. So everywhere you have proxies, you have networking, you have security. Can we deploy them to Kubernetes? Well, yeah, here's an open source project where someone reverse engineered what to do, wrote a Helm chart, and enabled autoscaling this way. There is now an official version also. Like, this was improved quite fast. But that was how we started. It's the same thing, but like it now reads in the documentation how do you do this. And then you need to know how to use Kubernetes, so you need to get something like Keda or comparable running, so the Kubernetes cluster automatically scales and so on, like the usual stuff. Then packages. GitHub packages came out at the same time as actions around. The problem was Docker support came later. So customers were like, okay, we have packages. I'm going to push the Docker images there. Yeah, the Docker images were not there yet. So then we had to explain to them, you don't have all the features that read in the packages web page. It reads in the server web page. You have to go to different documentation. And now we're working on how do we monitor actions. So I've been discussing with GitHub, and I have this small problem of I would like analytics to my customers. What is going on in their system? And I ask, can I get like how do I get the access to database? How do I like pull the data and push that to Snowflake? That's what I do with GitLab. Yeah, use the API. Well, we use the API, rate limiting ProKit, permissions ProKit, and it also doesn't enable us to track it. So we actually crash our GitHub Enterprise server by bombarding the API too much. So then we realized, hey, with the partner, thankfully we had a partner manager who discussed with the team and came back to us and told us, hey, you can actually write a GitHub app. And we were like, okay, GitHub app. And then we looked into it and we were like, oh, you can like install these to organizations, not globally, organizations. So you install per organization a GitHub app, and it goes back home to us with the webhook and sends us the data that we wanted from the action, and then we can build from that the analytics. So now we built quite a lot of infrastructure to know, are the jobs running? Is our GitHub, like, we know Kubernetes is working, but like, are the runners actually working? Like, are our Docker images working? Well, had to build something because customers would like analytics. That's fantastic. Fun times. Advanced security. So about a year ago, 11 months ago, I decided to do all the GitHub certificates. And in Finland, we have this thing called Midsummer. It's 4 days of getting drunk, sitting in a cabin, enjoying life. Like, you're supposed to enjoy life by not doing anything. Just grill, enjoy, sauna. Yeah. Well, I had the GitHub Advanced Security Certificate still undone. And I was like, okay, I need to actually learn this thing. So I went all in and decided to read about CodeQL, which is GitHub's like code analytics tool. You don't need to know anything about it, by the way, for the certificate if you decide to take it. Like, you don't need to go there. You can just use the ready-made templates and run them once, and you know what you're asked in the certificate. I went through the course of how do you write CodeQL for the searching of code malware, and how do you create your own searches. Holy shit, did I enjoy the whole Midsummer. Like, I was going so deep in IT. It has been like at least 10 years since I went last time to how a compiler works. What are we calling compiler things? Like, what comes out of the compiler? How do I create an SQL search for the compiler information? I was just like, wow, my head hasn't hurt this badly in a long time. I came out loving it, but also, yeah, never do it yourself. Like, buy a consultant to do it. Like, unless you actually work with compilers. yeah, it was a good midsummer. Yeah, there is actually a ready-made library, so you don't need to know any of this. But like, if you want to do some really advanced stuff with the code searching, it's you can actually do it without paying for GitHub if you just play around with it. Yeah. Then I added this new slide, mandatory AI slide. So, you know, like ChatGPT came out, and I'm talking about Microsoft Technology, who is an investor in OpenAI, and you know, Copilot and so on. Yeah, I really don't have anything else than positive to say about AI. It's solving so many things. Like, I can write my notes in Finnish, and then I can just start typing it in English, and Copilot takes care of it. It translates it to English. Accidental feature I found. Works perfectly. Few words got mistaken, but that's Finnish. Like, don't use it for Finnish. GitHub Copilot, if you want to buy it as a customer, you have to bring in the users to the GitHub Cloud. So you buy GitHub Enterprise Server to keep your user data safe and avoid like the cloud hassle. Now that you wanted the Copilot, like all the users that you want to use in the Copilot, bring them to cloud. Like, we want to know who is using it. Yep. Okay, that's still easy. So I buy my licenses through Efficode. Okay. We want to sell you GitHub Copilot. Okay. How do we sell GitHub Copilot? So we deploy to you an Azure tenant, an Azure subscription. We connect that Azure subscription to GitHub.com's ACR tooling. We connect that ACR to the GitHub account and Azure, and then we bill you with an Azure bill, the Copilot. And that's how you buy Copilot as a bill. Fantastic. Like, we're working on with GitHub to figure out if we could do it somehow differently, but that's how it works at the moment. So if someone needs it, thank our partner manager from Efficode side. He's been grinding this for 3 months now and trying to figure out how does it work, and nobody can tell him. But this is what we found out so far. Yeah, and as far as I know, I'm almost at the time based on my knowledge. So overall, even though this might sound negative, I have loved every single moment of working with GitHub. I recommend GitHub to everybody, like, oftentimes. It's super nice, like, using GitHub as a developer. Best thing ever. Like, the pull requests experience, that's why it's used by open source people. If it was bad, we would be in GitLab, we would be in Bitbucket, we would be somewhere else. We are very lazy beings. GitHub is getting better, and it keeps improving. Like, GitHub Actions, I was talking to Daniel, for example, here, that, hey, GitHub Actions allow you to do shared pipelines nowadays. So what that means is, in Jenkins, you have this thing called shared pipelines that you can create once pipeline and then use it everywhere with one line. Well, GitHub has the same thing, so you don't have to rewrite your pipelines. GitHub Actions are very amazing to write. I recommend everybody to try to write their own action. It opens your eyes on the architectural design and how you could have made Jenkins plugins in the history so that they would have been better than what they are. Our end users have been massively happy with GitHub, and even GitHub Enterprise Server. Like, they are not considering switching away from GitHub Enterprise Server. We've been able to improve our service over time and, like, uptimes, everything. Like, we have actually created a team. It's no longer that I get called if it crashes. We have, like, a bunch of people that know about things. You also heard the positives here. And, like, I think we have 40 people who certified to GitHub now. So, like, a bunch of people, when we got the certificates running from GitHub, they signed up immediately and wanted to get to know GitHub better, so that they know GitHub and working with GitHub. So it's been, like, loved in the organization also. So that's my talk about GitHub Enterprise Server and 10 years of me booting up and working on and fixing it. Thank you. Questions?
Yes, after that, any questions? Oh, wow.
Hello.
Hello.
So it's pretty obvious that this GitHub Enterprise server is amazing. What would you suggest as an alternative? So if you were starting from scratch for an on-prem version control system, especially because GitHub Enterprise is amazing. So, and you don't have the money to pay for that. What would you do?
So no money to pay for GitHub Enterprise server, and yeah, it's about $21 per phase plus the cost of the servers, which is like 64 gigabytes. So you can get pretty cheaply running with GitLab, for example. So that's something that works. GitLab's user UI, many people have their opinions about it. I have mine, but I will not be sharing them.
Maybe later.
Yeah, maybe later in the beers or like in the airport, like, you know. There's also tools like Gitea or comparables where you can deploy your own Git. And Bitbucket Data Center actually has lower tiers than 500 users, so you could actually run on Bitbucket still. So if you don't have the money, you need on-premise, first of all, check if you have enough consumption in Microsoft credits, because you might actually have the money. And you just didn't know it. But yeah, basically GitLab is probably currently the correct answer. Yeah.
Another question from the audience?
And we have tried giving SVN with Fire to the online.
That's a question on Slido, by the way.
Why would I go with GitHub versus GitLab in this case? Because you can already self-host GitLab and you go through less pain. In a sense, like I don't know the main difference between the two.
GitLab is not less pain. GitLab is less pain for a small company because you can take the Omnibus installation, install, upgrade, works. As soon as you go and you want to do a GitHub high availability or something larger with GitLab, it becomes like this thing where you have a sidekick where in row 185 it reads, Tom, to do, fix this, there might be a performance issue here. And yeah, there is performance issues. The sidekick crashes every X amount of time and you have to enable sidekick memory clear yourself from a script. They're working on it. We will get that one day. But there's these kind of things in GitLab. Thankfully, it's open source, so we've been able to find everything and read these things and understand what's going on. So we host GitLabs also. If you would just go and deploy GitLab, there is also the other thing, which is GitLab runners and GitLab specification. So GitLab specification for the jobs, this is not the scope of the talk, but GitLab jobs description is basically kind of like writing Bash. Like it feels like Bash. It's YAML, but it feels like I'm just gonna write it in Bash and run that script here. Versus in GitHub, you start writing these actions, and you actually think about like, okay, I'm gonna break this into small pieces that happen in separate Docker containers, and my developer doesn't have to understand any of this, but it happens automatically for them. So you actually create this immutable like infrastructure that keeps what's the English word like anyway, like every time you start from scratch in GitHub, and basically you don't have old package, so every job has to bring its own dependencies unless you enable things. But let's not talk about enabling things because I'm not talking GitHub Actions versus GitHub today. So yeah.
One more from the audience, maybe? We have a question on Slido.
Yep.
Why weren't you able to access the GitHub Enterprise database?
Oh, I can access it. I can get the data. I can do that. Like it's just against the license terms. So if I build something, which I build my analytics out of, and use that, and something breaks in the database, or something changes in the database, or anything else happens, GitHub support will be giving me some feedback very quickly. And we wouldn't be allowed to do things. And once again, we kind of want to be in good order with everybody. So we try to build solutions that support even if we would leave, for example, from the customer. So something we can tell customers in consulting also that, hey, this is how you do it. so that we don't have to put a disclaimer on front of it that, hey, to get to the database, that means that you're going to break every single rule in the book. And we also got explicitly told by GitHub that no. So yeah, but you can, like, of course, like, if I have an access to the server, I can go to the database.
Right. One more question? Yes.
Does GitHub Enterprise allow you to move the database server and Elasticsearch and other dependencies outside of that virtual machine, and then have like several different Ruby on Rails apps in front of behind a load balancer or something?
That's the clustering which you need to create the business case to get the permission from GitHub so that they enable the license to enable you clustering.
Oh, okay.
So yes, but no. So you can do it.
Technically,
it's there, but like even that doesn't allow you zero downtime upgrades. Yeah.
Sold to the gentleman in the front. We have one more question here.
I mean, you talked a little bit about scaling and GitHub. Can you give the largest example of users and stats where you made it possible to run GitHub?
Come on, you just want to quote about GitHub because he knows what I'm talking about. We talked about it in a beer. So our largest customer, I think, whom we worked as it's not in the managed services, it's in consulting, was 65,000 or 58,000, somewhere around there, something around 60,000 users, ballpark of developers. And they were running on-premise, so we got the consulting request and we sent the consultant, and they helped them move the machine to Google Cloud. So we deployed two machines to Google Cloud, one for the active and one for the passive. Largest thing that you can find, and that's the GitHub Enterprise. It was quite easy migration. Like, a lot of work went to it, but yeah. It scales like a lot. I don't know that many companies that have 60,000 developers.
All right, then thank you very, very much. We have a little gift for you.